Good morning, everyone. It is for me, at least. In fact, it's actually the morning after the Canadian federal election. And I would say it's probably not too surprising to some of you that I'm not pleased with the results. As many of you know, I'm not really a democracy guy. I think it's immoral. However, I did vote in the interest of self-interest, if nothing else, sort of a least of two evils, or lesser of two evils option, I suppose. At any rate, as I said, I'm disappointed in the results. We've got a guy essentially who's, the party platform of the Liberals is not really any different than the makeup of his cabinet and everything else is no different than the Liberal government that people were so dissatisfied with that would have easily lost the election prior to the election of Donald Trump and the stepping down of Justin Trudeau. And, they're no different, but of course they immediately pivoted to this anti-Trump Liberal platform, which, do I think that was a cynical political pivot in order to adopt this sort of, elbows up Canada, we can fight the Americans on their own terms or something like that attempt to get elected and to deflect from all the reasons that people were tired of the Liberals in the first place? Yes, I think that's exactly what happened. Am I disappointed in my fellow countrymen for voting for a party that they were all, a lot of them were disappointed in the results of the last 9 years of their leadership, supposed leadership, and somehow ended up voting them back in? Yeah, I definitely am. I think arguably people are easily swayed by narratives and platitudes, et cetera. Essentially, we've got a guy who people have said, well, he understands economics, right? Because he's got a doctorate in economics from Oxford. And, so he understands these things. He's run central banks, et cetera, at the same time as, he took an already irresponsible platform of running high deficits for, the same platform that Trudeau had when he first got elected. We're going to run modest deficits for the first few years and then we're going to balance the budget. And of course, claimed that he had this mandate for doing so because he got elected on that platform, but never fulfilled the mandate by balancing the budget, right? He did the first part, the running the deficits, and never balanced the budget. And then, just blames the pandemic for not being able to do that, as though you had to spend all that money during the pandemic, as though you shouldn't actually have a surplus, so that if something like a pandemic were to happen, you would actually have money to weather that storm, as any responsible business or person or family or government would do, right? It's not as though these are fledgling countries. And by the way, this is, as many of you have heard me say before, this is my primary criticism of Donald Trump, is that he's run the highest, deficits, added more to the debt than pretty much any president in U.S. history. I think that's the single largest criticism that someone should have of him. But, most liberal voters don't have that criticism of Donald Trump because they've never thought of it or whatever, but also because their own darlings, the darlings of the left, have done the same thing. Barack Obama had, added more to the debt, I believe, than pretty much all the presidents before him. And nobody really had a problem with that, partially because people like to be promised free stuff, which is exactly what the Liberals do. They do it here in Canada as well. But it's not like these are fledgling countries, that like some business startup or young family utilizes some debt to springboard themselves into viability, et cetera, and, with a plan to pay it off, to become fiscally responsible and move beyond that debt. No, these are countries that are well established, that just continually run deficits, that make promises of free stuff to people and continue to add to the debt and add to the debt and add to the debt with nothing more than lip service really to paying it back down. to acknowledging the debt service ratios that, that they have to have in order to do that, that how much we pay to service the debt, what could you do with the money that you are using to service that debt, et cetera, because of course these politicians, generally speaking, have got a limited time frame to do their bidding, and they're not held to any kind of account after the fact. So Justin Trudeau is going to have his government pension. He's going to be well looked after. He was already a trust fund baby anyway. He's going to be well looked after, but there's no hell to pay for the fact that he didn't fulfill that part of the mandate, right? There's no penalty to him. There's no penalty to a government other than potentially being voted out at some point for not fulfilling that part of a mandate if they were, so bold as to say something like that. And of course, they only say it in service of wanting to run the deficit in the first place. If you have a mandate, you have a mandate, and it's for the things that you maybe don't want to do is that you promise as much as the things that you would like to do, right? And of course, they don't treat it as such. And then Trudeau and the Liberal Party had already projected a certain number of deficits forward, pretty large ones. And Carney, as part of his election platform, was going to almost pretty much double those. Add that much more again to our debt. So to me, that, I've made the case before. I think that's immoral. Deficit finance is immoral, not the least of which because you're borrowing money in people's names who can't consent, people who've not yet reached the age of majority and actually at least voice their consent or dissent to that by voting. And arguably, when you have a large enough debt that you can't pay back anytime soon, you're actually borrowing money in the name of people who have yet to be born. That's fraud. That's just outright fraud. That's unethical. Come at me, bro. And I'm constantly amazed at people who will make some kind of an argument for groups of people somehow having rights that individual peoples don't, as though that hasn't been responsible for, the deaths of many hundreds of millions of people throughout our lifetime or throughout our species' lifetime. And, this is the foundation of our modern politic, right? Is that large groups of people can impose their will on smaller groups of people, and that's somehow okay, especially if we just call it a republic or something like that. But we're still engaging in that behavior, even if we have corralled off a few things that are considered to be no-go zones, and we attack those too anyway. I've been thinking a lot about this in terms of who Carney is, because I do think that he's an unethical person based on a lot of his business dealings and the things that he's done. He's at least inconsistent, I would say anyway. This notion of the sort of elbows up movement, which is ludicrous on its face, as though we can, one-on-one win any kind of a conflict with the United States of America, militarily, economically, culturally even, et cetera, et cetera. We just don't have the horsepower for it. And I think it's ridiculous to get people riled up on that basis. I've heard people, immediately, Carney was the one who switched. He had barely been put into power. Ironically, of course, the self-same people that I see arguing on my Facebook feed about the fact that Elon Musk wasn't elected to anything, which bureaucrats aren't, right? So they're appointed. So that's a non-issue or a non-argument. We're silent when Carney was instilled as our prime minister without the will of the people. Anyway, virtually right after he was put into power, he made the claim that suddenly, after all these years, because of a little bit of a trade dispute or whatever, our relationship with the United States of America is essentially over, which I think is highly dangerous. And you had all kinds of editorials written about how we're on a war footing. We're still trading with the U.S., of course. We still actually have open trade with the U.S., and we got people making declarations that we're on a war footing. Highly irresponsible propaganda, essentially. But I've been thinking a lot about this, and of course there's we could get into why I think Carney is an immoral person. I think that, he had the opportunity to at least voice his support for Canada and loyalty to Canada, corporate loyalty to Canada when Brookfield had moved its corporate headquarters and all of this kind of thing. And of course, he's part of that political class that usually likes to talk about making the rich, the wealthy pay their fair share, et cetera, when usually, at least in the political class, he's not been in politics but about this long, which is interesting as well. It's interesting to me to see people pivot. When it suits their argument, a career politician is a good thing. They have the experience, et cetera, et cetera. When it doesn't suit them, they say, oh, he's a career politician. That can't be good. That means unethical. And the same thing when someone does or doesn't have political experience, right? It depends on whether they support the person for the position, is essentially whether or not they make the argument that he's only been in corporate America, et cetera, his whole career. So that makes him unqualified to be in politics, or oh, he's got all this business experience, which makes him qualified. I just wish people would be at least consistent with that. Universalize your principle. If that's a principle, you got to apply it equally, and people don't. They just use it to make the argument du jour to support the character they want. And I think most people are not even aware that that's what they're doing. I think most people are unaware of how inconsistent they're being with their so-called principles. And all the things about Brookfield, having at least a facade of headquarters moved to the Isle of Man, which of course, like the Cayman Islands, is a tax haven, and having, it's a literal facade. It's actually kind of a small apartment building, which is where the corporate headquarters are apparently located. And, the acquisition of other companies that have been engaged in, I would say, unethical practices and things that normally liberals would be riling against, things like denying health claims to people and profiting off of fossil fuel exploration and things like that. And then later on, as a politician, being against coal, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, I don't think you'd have to dig too far if you disagree with me or didn't know Carney's background, but I think he's an unethical person. And I think what it is people will. Do I think that he's openly unethical? Do I think that he's a bad faith actor in terms of his own beliefs? And I'm not sure about that. I've seen interviews with him. I've seen a videotape of him and a business partner discussing a lot of the success of their companies and whatnot. And what I think is going on there largely is compartmentalization, internal compartmentalization with the things that he's been responsible for, that a lot of us on an analysis of it would deem to be unethical. And I think that people, in the same way that I was just referring to about people not universalizing their principles and making an argument one way when it suits them and then the opposite way when it suits them. I think that's probably a lot of what's going on here is people, and it probably starts small, and then over time, you just keep rationalizing to yourself that this is okay because, and this is okay because, and you form a pattern of this. And then you reach a point in time when you're running the Bank of England and and then fast forward to campaigning to be Prime Minister of Canada. And I think this becomes exacerbated by the disparities that we have in class. And so a person then, you get to a point where you're completely insulated from the results of your own actions, the downstream effects, the downstream impacts of the decisions that you've made and the policies that you've put forward, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, in many respects, that's not even necessarily a criticism, because that's just a natural extension of what's going to happen. That's just how that works when you have those kind of disparities, between the life experience of those who are making big decisions like that, big plays, big moves, and the people downstream who actually are the ones who have to wear the results of those actions, beyond the pure profit ones. You've essentially left a string of bodies behind you, and you're actually not even aware of it to a degree. I think that's what's actually going on here. And I think that's a very charitable take. I mean, I think he should be aware of it. He's obviously intelligent enough to be aware of it, but I'm not sure how aware he actually is. You know, in other words, I don't think he's Burnsian sitting behind the, you know, after the camera's off, yes. I don't think that's what's going on here. Now, this all dovetails with a lot of things that I've been thinking about myself recently with regards to my own family. And that's where the title of this video comes in, you know, what is a loser? I've been reading a lot of the things that my parents left behind. My dad passed away in 2013, my mom in 2019, and they did leave some things behind, of course. And I've been reading a lot of them lately. I've been taking time. I'll gather up a bunch of things into a briefcase and I go to a coffee shop and I sit and I just kind of go through them. And it's been interesting. You know, my dad died alone and had been diagnosed bipolar. It affected probably the last 10, 12, 14, 15 years of his life. We were estranged for the last 13 of those because of that, because of threats that had been made and things that had happened. And he ended up dying alone. My mom had left him. You know, he left behind some things, and these were writings. You know, they were like letters to other people and whatnot. And the reason he left them behind, I don't think it was that he wrote these letters and didn't send them. I think these were drafts. And, you know, my dad died having never owned a computer and having never owned a cell phone. You might think of that as pretty backwards, even in 2013, and in some ways it was. If you were thinking that he was some kind of a backwards hick or something like that, you'd be mistaken. He actually had a master's degree in business administration. I found his thesis recently. It had something to do with the price per share earnings of corporations and the effects of mergers and acquisitions on those price per earning shares, an analysis of that. So, you know, he was a very intelligent person. In fact, pretty much everyone who knew him would state, and I've seen this, I've heard other people talk about it, I've seen other people write about it, that not only was he probably the smartest person that they knew, actually most people who knew him said they deemed him to be the smartest person they would probably ever know. He was a very, very intelligent man. He left home at 15 years old, just before he was 16, and had to support himself, and supported himself right through a Bachelor of Science and an MBA. He was a very intelligent man. He died in a sea of books, right? His house was quite literally filled with books. And he was a bit of a Renaissance man in that regard. You know, he had books on topics ranging from boat building to beekeeping to wood timber frame houses to economics to political, you know, conquests and conflicts and philosophy, religion, esoteric pursuits, music, like you name it, he had books on it. He was an avid reader. Now, the interesting thing about this that sort of ties into all this is some of his writings were talking about his early corporate career, because of course he had an MBA. What was he doing living in British Columbia as a carpenter? How did that happen? And I knew the sort of general story. You know, there was a bit of a narrative that existed while I was a kid, and I wasn't sure, you know, at my age now, thinking back to it, how accurate that was, how I even sort of picked this up. But the narrative was essentially that he'd gotten into the corporate world, that was where he was going to go, and he didn't like the corporate backstabbing and the unethical behavior, et cetera, and so he decided to move to the countryside and live off the land. There was a book that was written, I think in the 50s maybe, can't remember exactly, and I think it was called The Good Life, and my parents had discovered that book, and they decided that was what they were going to do. They were going to move to Idaho or Montana or somewhere like that, and they ended up, because of a family acquaintance, moving to British Columbia instead. And they did, you know, what they set out to do. They learned how to live off the land, etc., etc. And a couple of city kids, they were not prepared for it, but nonetheless, they did it because they were smart enough to figure it out. And here we are. Now, the writings that I found left behind by my dad, he was talking to someone who he was newly acquainted with, I would suppose, and he was explaining his life to this person, which is a real treasure trove for me to find left behind. And he talked about the fact that, he went into the corporate world. We were living in Chicago, Illinois at the time. He was working for Gillette in their corporate accounting department. He'd moved up really quickly too. He'd received his MBA at the end of the 1960s, and we moved to Canada in 1974. And he had already had a number of promotions, was already working in the central accounting department, was part of internal audits, project management audits, research and development audits, etc., was moving up the corporate ladder very quickly. And he had said a couple of things. He said, it was interesting until he figured it out, which took like no time at all. And then it was one of the most boring jobs in the world. And also, he felt that it was damaging his personal integrity, the things that he was sort of being forced to do, and the things that were required of him to move up the corporate ladder. Or the things that would be required to move up the corporate ladder, which he had already done to some degree. And, there's the obligatory pictures of him, I have them, at the golf course with, a handful of other corporate executives. And this was not my dad. Like, if you knew my dad, my dad would be more likely to be sailing across a lake quietly in British Columbia, in the nude probably, then he would be, at home on a corporate junket or whatever, or at a golf course, etc., etc. Like that's not the guy that I knew. And it obviously wasn't the guy that he wanted to be either. And so he wrote about this, how, he said, and this was in about 2006 that this was dated. And he wrote about the fact that, he could have stayed on and he would have made several, multiples of $100,000 a year back when that was worth, multiples of what it would be today. And of course, today at that point was 2006. And I've thought a lot about what that means, what that would have meant for my life, if he'd have stayed behind, if he'd have stayed working for, Gillette. Maybe not, he would have been moved around, I'm pretty sure. His rise was pretty meteoric for who he was. Right, he was he didn't attend Oxford. He was no Carney. He didn't have the privilege probably that Carney had. And these are the parallels I'm drawing, of course, in case you haven't figured that out. He didn't attend Oxford. He attended the University of Colorado. He attended the University of Washington because he had to put himself through college. I mean, he did this supporting himself from the age of 15. Quite remarkable, I think. But he had a pretty meteoric rise in the corporate world from that standpoint, from that starting point. And I think about what that would have meant for me, because of course there would have been different educational opportunities for me. There would have been a different path for me a different example set for me to sort of follow. And there probably would have been, likely, if my dad had stayed in that environment, there would have been actually likely even maybe some pressure for me to follow a certain academic pathway, et cetera, et cetera. And what that would have meant for me in terms of opportunities, maybe an opportunity for me also to subjugate my own integrity, for the want of the almighty dollar, et cetera, et cetera. As it was, my dad was a Red Seal tradesman here in British Columbia. The Red Seal, of course, is our accreditation here, right? It's a red government seal affixed to a certificate. We call them Red Seals here. So my dad was a Red Seal tradesman. I became a Red Seal tradesman. My brother became a Red Seal tradesman. And, it was never really discussed. It was that was the path that we followed. It was the path that was made available to us. I was, during the point in time in which I was graduating from high school, we were poor enough, I guess you could call it, that the principal of my high school actually paid for my graduation jacket. We had this sort of varsity jacket type things with the leather sleeves, that a lot of high schools would have. And we couldn't afford it. We couldn't afford the jacket. And my high school principal actually paid for mine. So that was, that was where we were financially at the time. And so, back to my dad, he couldn't see himself going down this road. He talked about selling his soul. He talked about, the damage to his integrity by staying on with something like that. He saw it early. He recognized it early. He understood what was going to be required for him to do the things that he would need to do in order to stay in that world and be successful in that world, despite the fact that he could have been very successful in that world. Again, given his meteoric rise in such a short few years, he definitely was going places. And they decided to move, and we moved to Canada and started from nothing and slowly built up a life here, and here we are. Now, my question is, does that qualify him as a loser? And I say that sort of juxtaposing him against, well, any otherwise successful person in big business, and especially big business with revolving doors through bureaucracies and governments themselves, the ruling class, like a Mark Carney. People who arguably, and maybe you disagree with me on Carney, maybe you think that he's on the up and up, and all of these things are at the very least just arm's length issues, like the denial of health claims and the offshoring of tax liabilities and all these, maybe, and the moving away of corporate headquarters and then claiming to be patriotic, things like that. Maybe you think these are all arm's length issues. I'm sure, given my audience, replace him with a gas and oil mogul or someone like that, right? Who's also been involved in politics. In other words, I'm saying, you can substitute anyone you like for this. I think that Carney is that person. And as I've said before, I think I've been quite charitable in my assessment of him in that regard. But I do think that he's a cynical politician, at least now, pretty recently so, but also because of a lot of the narratives, a lot of the rationalizations he's been able to probably utilize to get himself to this point without feeling like he's lost his integrity. A person who can actually hold their head high when they're making a victory speech and lay claim, to sort of being, on the good side, on the right side of history, whatever you want to say. I'm sure you can figure someone to put in his place if you disagree with me. The point that I'm making is, again, this is all in light of a lot of the recent introspection that I've been doing about my own life, my parents, my dad's trajectory, my dad's path in life, and where that led him and us. And what does that mean, again, for personal integrity, for the world, for the planet, in light of the fact that, the majority of the world is run by people who are less scrupulous, I would argue, than that. Lest I should let the cat, all the way out of the bag, as Kramer would say. Yes, I would say, my tentative conclusion is that no, my dad was not a loser for recognizing and kind of acknowledging the things that would be required to be successful in that world, and deciding that, he wanted to maintain his own integrity and move out to the bush and try to live off the land. At the very least, it wasn't as though this was some sort of a cop-out or an easier path. I mean, it required a lot of my parents to learn this life. It's not an easy life, and it's not easy to learn when you've both been raised in the city and you come from the corporate golf course, and you suddenly are learning how to run a chainsaw and utilize kerosene lanterns and figuring out how to do all of the things, right? Now, I guess a more difficult question for me to answer is, what would I prefer? there are many times when I go to one of the mountain peaks, the places that I like to go to when I'm up in the bush by myself. And there's, a couple of places, one in particular that I call my perch. It's a place that I can get to. It's several hours from here, but it's relatively easy to get to in some ways. And I can hike up to this spot, and I'm overlooking a valley. I'm looking right down a valley. It's kind of a box canyon valley. I can see pretty much all the way up to the end of it. It's fringed by mountains with glaciers. You can hear roaring creeks down in the valley below. And it's just a stunning vista. And I will thank my parents out loud standing at this place for bringing us here. And ultimately, I would say I'm glad that, I ended up where I ended up, largely because of, decisions like that I had no part in a way. But I certainly wonder, what opportunities I would have had, what difference my life would have been. Obviously, I probably would have been in the United States my whole life, likely. Or if I had moved, it would have been probably to pursue some corporate interest, likely, because I probably would be a college graduate myself. And I probably would have been, motivated to move into some corporate field of some sort. I'm going to guess, but, there's no way of knowing. At any rate, as I mentioned, I'm not real pleased with the outcome of our federal election here. I'm hoping that people will at some point realize what's going on, what's been going on, the fact that, we're going to go deeper in debt as a nation, and that's likely going to impact inflation and everything else. And, the people are sort of drunk on the free stuff, the promises of free stuff. I did see a lot of people posting on Facebook about they just can't vote against the Liberals because they're afraid they're going to lose their free dental care. And I sort of get it. I sort of understand. I just wish people themselves understood that ultimately that's not really going to last. I mean, it already isn't lasting. The Liberals have already backed off on a lot of that. That's what happens. What they want is the benefit of the promise of the free stuff. They don't want to actually have to pay for the free stuff. And so, been a number of cases of people immediately being denied, even though they meet all the requirements. And then there's the bureaucratic red tape, delays and whatnot. Meanwhile, they're in distress because their teeth are hurting and they can't actually get the government to pony up with what they said they would do. And, actually, I have no problem with someone who takes advantage of a government program like that because it's there, but actually speaks out against it, ethically or conceptually or whatever, and votes against the party, but actually, takes advantage of the things that are there. I mean, I think we all I think if you're being fair-minded, you kind of got to realize that everybody's going to maximize their legal tax liabilities and or minimize them, of course, and maximize their utilization of the things that are available to them. But on an ethical basis, on a moral basis, I think, you gotta understand that any of these kind of expenditures are necessarily born from debt. When it's a new expenditure and you're already running a deficit. I mean, that's just how that works, right? If you're already not making your payments as a family and you buy a new couch, that couch was necessarily born from debt as well. And that's the way these things function. I think it's unethical. And, I don't think we're going in a good place, in a good direction. But Carney gets to maintain himself, at least amongst the, the corporate media, they didn't really push back very hard against him. They were always very gentle in their treatment of Trudeau as well, because, they know where their bread is buttered, right? They all get grants and federal dollars, and I think that's obviously a mistake. You can't buy off your media. I mean, you can, but this is what you get, of course. Carney gets to be trotted out there as, as a part of the legitimate class, et cetera, and I think he's just part of the problem, obviously. Obviously, I think he's part of the problem. He's a big part of the problem. It's guys like him that are a big part of the problem. It's hard for me to fathom that people can be giving him this air of legitimacy because he has a doctorate in economics while he's simultaneously proposing, as part of his election strategy even, to borrow more money in the name of people who haven't consented to it, can't consent to it, don't consent to it, have actively dissented, by voting against him. And you just have to take it in the ass. So, but I'd be interested to know what you think. Do you think that my dad was a loser for shunning the opportunities that were there, that he'd worked really hard for, that he had, arguably worked very hard for and had laid in front of him in the interest of maintaining his integrity? Or do you think that someone like Carney is a loser ultimately, in the ultimate sense? He's obviously, not economically a loser. I mean, again, getting back to the media giving these guys a pass, he never really did answer the questions about his business ties that he still may have. Where are his personal assets invested? He never answered any of those questions. He never really answered any questions about where he pays his taxes. That this is all a big mystery to people, partially because the media gave him a pass on that, because the media prefers a liberal politician. Again, they know where their bread is buttered. But do you think that someone like Carney, or again, insert your corporate cad, of choice, do you think they're the losers in an ultimate sense? Obviously, I guess that depends on your definition of loser, because I would say probably they're not losers. They're just bad actors, or they're, you could say maybe evil, certainly selfish, very, very self-centered at the expense of other people. Let me know what you think. Thanks for watching.